with respect to what we see coming as the global economic and environmental collapse continues. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., again, it's not how long you live, it's how well you live. And would you rather live with dignity, or would you rather live on your knees in utter submission to a system that doesn't give a shit about you? So I'm going to leave it at that, and let's jump right into the questions. Okay, question number one, I'll have to paraphrase this. It basically asks why I don't make explicit the central management system as being open source, and that there's a criticism that there would be no transparency or the programmers are in control. And I know exactly what you're saying, because this rhetoric goes back to criticisms of so-called central planning, that it's the assumption that there's this ruling elite that allows everything and engages everything and makes all the decisions. That isn't what the management system is at all. And it is open source, to answer your question, first of all. It's open source, everyone can interact with it, but humans aren't the evaluative, can't talk today. Humans are not the evaluative mechanism, if that makes any sense. Humans aren't the ones making the decisions. You're interacting with a mechanized system that is technically evaluating all proposals, because we recognize that everything is technical. So, actually, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go on examples of this because that's not what the question is and I don't have that much time. But yes, it's open source, everyone can interact with it. And the way it's set up is for maximum technical evaluation and removal of humans as a decision-making entity. Even if programmers went so far to program it with some form of advantage, it would eventually be figured out. Okay, number two, Peter, what is your opinion on changing public consciousness and how might this be done? And then he goes to recommend a book that I'm not familiar with called Science and Sanity. If anyone else is out there, well, that's great. And if you want to promote it, okay, I can throw out the name of the book, Science and Sanity, but that's about all I can do. I think I've made many comments in the past on changing public consciousness through education, and earlier in this broadcast I talked about, the media project, live media project, as Zeitgeist Day, and all of these ways of trying to engage society both intellectually and aesthetically. So that's where we are now, but obviously we're open to new ideas. And as far as other angles of semantics, as you point out with your book, Science and Sanity, I'd have to read it to find more about it, so sorry I can't answer your question. Number three, I see a lot of people in the movement actually wanting a financial collapse or series of collapses. My question is, isn't it true that if the movement fails in preventing financial collapse from occurring via raising awareness about the flawed design of the monetary system and putting a resource-based economy on a table as a possible solution, that it will only add to the number of obstacles we already have in getting the resource-based economy out in the open? Yes, I completely agree. We don't want some huge collapse. We want to stop the system. Well, in my view, I wish to see the systems halted before it gets too bad, because it will create more problems. We could get past the point of no return, so to speak. So I don't want to see more suffering. I want to see people come together and say, listen, we're not going to take this anymore, and we see what's on the horizon, and we want to stop it before it gets too bad. But unfortunately, as I stated before, and as Jacques certainly recognizes, people are not rational, and it's going to take a form of inconvenience and pressure for many people to snap out of the droning perception that they have with respect to the current model. And number four, question, considering our practical philosophy, what do you think about members who stress the spirituality of, open quote, we are all one, closed quote, above everything else? Question mark, people who believe in astrology and other pseudosciences despite the evidence, isn't denying evidence to preserve faith directly against what we talk about here? And then he makes another comment about in the Spanish forums that moderators were called fascists because they wanted to disassociate from people promoting their religious agenda through the Zeitgeist movement and vice versa. Okay, well, you're bringing up a series of very complex issues because it's so difficult to understand what people are even referring to in those contexts. If you're speaking about pseudoscience in general, which means that there's no physical referent, they're talking about things that can't be replicated and they're making projections. The we are all one comment is really a poetic statement in the interpretation that I've come to learn, which is completely synergistic. It's a synergistic and symbiotic observation. That's it. It's a mechanical notion. There's nothing spiritual about it unless you define spirituality in that context, which, of course, you open up a whole can of worms. But to answer your question as I can interpret it, anyone out there that's trying to promote a, quote, religious agenda, well, they can't possibly understand the movement then, if that's their frame of reference. Again, I can't definitively understand your question. I can only surmise that if someone's out there promoting things that have no factual basis to it, that are, I don't know, like 2012. Someone's out there talking about how the Zeitgeist movement will align with 2012. I've actually heard this rhetoric. That can be shunted to the side, but don't just, delete them or ban them because of some views like that. You talk to them, and if they're not open to criticism or new ideas about what they're trying to promote, well, you have to take it on a per-case basis based on the behavior of the individual. Usually they'll just go away if they don't feel that their values are being mirrored. Number 5, Peter, what do you think is the biggest challenge for us as a movement right now, and what are your thoughts on the movement's progress? I think given the current environment, the movement's progress has been spectacular. If you really think about what we're talking about and what we advocate and how radical it would appear to the, quote, normal person. So, and as far as the biggest challenge is the challenge it always was, and that's trying to permeate the indoctrination of people and getting them to, quote, open their minds or at least be vulnerable to new data that completely contradicts everything that they've been taught, most likely. So the biggest challenge is psychological. Number 6, I am rather fond of dark humor, violent video games, and adult content. What do you think will happen to these media? Will they exist during a transition? Furthermore, I ask what entertainment exists in a resource-based economy in respect to the aforementioned topics. My answer would be I have no idea. I'll tell you what I do know, though. Historically speaking, there have been various phenomena that would be considered popular for a given culture, such as 600, 700 years ago, I believe the Aztecs doing rituals where they rip out people's hearts and show it to them before they die. Now, that might have been considered some form of perverted normality on a certain level, just as some things we see today might be considered the same way. So I really couldn't tell you. The question is of an evolutionary nature, and it really comes down to what values become sustainable. I don't blame violent video games for, say, the Columbine massacre, but you can see how that action would reinforce a certain hardened quality to kids that are so used to it, where they might lose a sense of reality and they might gain, actually pleasure from killing really real people, just as they do in the virtual sense. Does that mean I think those things should be restricted? No. I think really it comes down to education and awareness and creating balance in the individual. One thing our society has proven is that, no, we don't have people running in circles with M16s mimicking everything they see in the latest action movie with people's heads being blown off and guts ripped out. You don't have serial killers watching movies about serial killers getting inspired by that notion per se. Very, very rare. So what has been proven is that people are actually quite balanced if they're brought up correctly, and they can see the difference between reality and art. And I think that will continue. And I think the more people's needs are met in a new society, the more such media either will evolve or diminish in its existence. So I don't know what media will be in the future, but I would keep this thought in mind. Just as we look back on early civilizations that engaged in all sorts of horrific practices that we would never think about today, I think in the future people will look back at us and the media that we watch and the things that we find entertaining and consider us to be quite aberrated as well in an equal context. So just kind of keep that in mind. And one final scientific point that just popped in my mind, which I think is worth pointing out. You state that you're rather fond of blank, blank, and blank. I think you might want to think about why you're fond of it. Why do you like what you like, and where did that influence come from? Music, for example, I grew up in a very arrogant culture of musicians that thought there was a differentiation between what you could consider good and bad music. And there is no empirical measure at all. It's a completely subjective understanding, completely subjective relationship, excuse me. It has to do with certain dopamine receptors. There was a nice little section on this by Dr. Robert Sapolsky about how people become groomed to certain styles of music and reactions of music, or you can apply this to any form of media, by the way. And almost in an arbitrary way, they begin to fire dopamine responses, meaning pleasure responses and other things, to music of that source or that style or deviation of it, and that's how the process continues of what their preference might be. So there's a large amount of arbitrary influence, if you will, that comes from many different angles. I think could go at many other angles if the environmental influences were different at those core points where those influences were being generated. I hate to sound kind of cold with it, but in many cases, or at least on certain levels, your values are arbitrary. What you like, you think you might like in the future, but if you were born into a completely different environment, or if you spent a great deal of time around people of a completely different mindset, they would rub off on you, and you would be groomed to the culture. So I'll leave it at that. Next question. Number 7, here's a two-part question. Since the release of Zeitgeist moving forward, have you been contacted much by media sources or anyone to note? How has that transpired? Honestly, I've been a little amazed at, given the global release, the few mainstream American outlets that have contacted me. I've had a lot of contacts from Europe, and usually what I do is I push them over to the chapters, because that's really, they should be contacting the chapters. While the film is mine, of course, meaning it's my communication, my gesture, obviously the film is in complete advocation of the movement and the Venus Project, more so than addendum. So, I push it on them, but generally speaking, not that much. I've had some interaction with some mainstream people that tried to use the Zeitgeist moving forward release as a way to try and get to me because of the Jared Loughner, Tucson, Arizona murder nonsense that occurred with the blame of my first film. But once they talked to me and realized, I wasn't going to tell them about Elvis hanging out at Area 451, they had nothing to use, and it wasn't their MO to really talk about the film, even though it is one of the largest global independent releases in history. But then again, Zeitgeist Day has pretty much broken records every year. It's been going with how many people it's brought together, and it's still ignored. So what are you going to do? Your second question is, quote, very broad question, but any thoughts you have would be great. I have read that quite a few economists are expecting food riots in the U.S. this year, and with big cuts coming to Europe this year, it doesn't seem unlikely to expect riots like Egypt happening on a more global scale. The prospect of chaos is daunting. Do you think this likely will happen this year, or am I being too paranoid? I don't think you're being too paranoid if you understand what I've been talking about, and you understand the interrelationships, the synergistic relationship of the economic structure, how it permeates all facets. When one section fails, it has big repercussions throughout other sections. And no, I would not be surprised whatsoever if you saw the activity you see in Egypt begin to happen in the West and in the United States. I don't think people realize how fragile what the current environment is, but I'm not going to go on that tangent. But to answer your question very simply, no, I don't think you're being too paranoid. I am terrified by what can be triggered very, very rapidly in the United States and in the West and the UK. All it takes is a certain simple combination of faults and problems and deficiencies, and you'll see complete chaos. Okay, number 8. Peter, how quick do you see advancements in technology and cures for cancer and diseases once scientific research is no longer limited to funding? I think a resource-based economy would allow for an unprecedented rate of human evolution. End of question. Well, obviously, if you listen to the things that I've talked about and Jacques talked about, we see this financial system as a gigantic hindrance, and I think it will be cataclysmic once we open up the floor to what's actually possible and what the current rate of science and technology tells us. Not to throw this out there in a I'm hesitant to do this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway because I just don't care anymore. There have been cures for cancer over and over and over again. There's a man by the name of Brzezinski who's been condemned as a quack and a pea doctor who has been curing cancer for decades. He operates out of Texas. It's one case study after another. The FDA has rigged his trials. He has been brought to the court dozens of times, if I remember correctly, in false attempts by the government to shut him down, because if his patent essentially could override the entire whole of the cancer establishment, trillions and trillions of dollars. So there's a case in point, and I know a lot of people will attack me for that comment because there's a lot of people out there that really don't buy it, but I've seen people that are cured of cancer, permanent remission, brain tumors, okay? It isn't some shot in the dark. So, answer your question, absolutely. We would see an outrageous move of advancement if the monetary system was removed. And that's the biggest argument